So, if you're confused about the German maneuvers, you really do need to take a look at the map I posted on Blackboard. It'll just make 1,000 times more sense if you just look at it visually. And ultimately, it's not that complicated. But I think just listening to it, it sounds very complicated. So yeah, take a minute and look at the map, and this whole thing will make a lot more sense. So what happens is that the Russians retreat to Stalingrad, and they're given time because of Hitler's mistakes and his maneuvers to formulate a strategy. And you have basically the Soviets have about 750,000 men in the Sixth Army and the Fourth Panzer Army approaching Stalingrad. And one of the things that I want to point out now is that Stalingrad, it's on the Volga River. It's an industrial city. It was a new city. And it's one of those cities that's divided in half by a river. It's kind of like if you know Austin, South Austin and North Austin is divided by the Colorado River, which is, I guess, called Lady Bird Lake now. So Stalingrad is a very, very long city. It's not a thick city, but it hugs the river basically, the Volga River on both sides. So from north to south, Stalingrad is a city that's very long, and it's divided in half by the Volga River, the Volga River. And the other thing to remember about the Volga River, it's kind of like the Russian Mississippi. It's the heart of Russia, and it was just stunning to the Soviets and very demoralizing that the Germans looked like they were going to capture the Volga River, at least around the region of Stalingrad, and that would have been, strategically and logistically a disaster for the Soviets. Stalingrad was an important production center, but also, as the Mississippi River is, the Volga River was a major transportation artery as well, a major communications artery. So, for symbolic reasons, for logistical reasons, the capture of Stalingrad would have been a real disaster from the point of view of the Soviet Union, which Hitler grasped that. In July of 1942, Stalin issues his famous Order 227, not one step back. And he orders it really in the context of the offensive against Stalingrad. And basically what he's saying is that the Russian army has to make a stand. It's been retreating. It had been retreating all summer towards Stalingrad, but the time for retreat was over. And so this is one of the iconic moments in World War II, the not one step back order, which was designed to stiffen the morale of the Soviet army. But at the same time, as you know, you have elements of the Soviet army that are behind the lines, making sure that anybody that retreats is shot. You have to move forward, or you can't retreat, or you'll be killed by your own troops. But long story short, it's a desperate situation in Stalingrad. So by late August, the German Sixth Army, assisted by the Fourth Panzer Army, and again, panzers are tanks, are advancing on the city of Stalingrad. And the German Sixth Army, which is really brutal, but is really stupid. What they do is, beginning on August 23rd, and you don't have to remember this, just remember late August 1942, they start bombing Stalingrad. And they spend a week, the Luftwaffe, spend about a week bombing Stalingrad. 90% of the housing stock in Stalingrad was obliterated. Up to 70,000 civilians lost their lives. So in one sense, it's a disaster for Stalingrad. The industrial areas were bombed, but it turns out that the bombing of Stalingrad and really the attack on Stalingrad was a major tactical mistake on the part of the German army, because the secret to the German success in the Soviet Union and in Western Europe as well had been its mobility. Think about the blitzkrieg, the movement of its tank, the movements of its infantry, the coordinated movement of the German army was really the secret to its success. But what happens in Stalingrad is the Germans voluntarily enter into an urban war, a war in a city. And what the Germans did by bombing Stalingrad was they created all kinds of defensive positions for the Soviet army to fight from. So it turns out that the bombing of Stalingrad, although it really was pretty devastating, turned out to create a bit of an advantage for the Soviets in creating a very, very difficult defensive position that the Germans found ultimately impossible to crack. So, big picture, the major mistake of the German army in Stalingrad is they move from a mobility, an army that is very, very mobile, can move very, very quickly, can surround the enemy and capture the enemy, into urban warfare, where it negates much of its mobility. Tanks were a major part of the Stalingrad battle, but you just don't have mobility when you're fighting in urban warfare. You're fighting in the ruins of a city. And the Soviets were able to maintain a very, very powerful defensive position. So a city in ruins is actually a lot easier to defend than a city where all the buildings are still standing. And the Germans found it very, very difficult to dislodge the Soviets from their positions in this landscape of rubble. And so the Germans are finding it hard to resupply their positions in Stalingrad, whereas the Red Army could supply their positions through tunnels and sewers that they knew about. And the other thing is the German army they captured, there were 6 districts in Stalingrad. And ultimately, the German army captured on around 90% of the western bank of Stalingrad, the western area of the city. So they capture about 90% of the area of Stalingrad that is on the western bank of the Volga. But the Soviets control the portions of Stalingrad on the eastern bank of the Volga. And that's how they resupply Stalingrad. That's how they resupply their forces across the Volga River. And the other thing is that Soviet artillery can continue to pound the German army from the eastern bank of the Volga River. So the Germans capture most of the western bank of Stalingrad, 90%. They never capture the whole thing, although they come very, very close to capturing the entire thing. But they don't capture the eastern half of Stalingrad on the other side of the Volga River, which is a major river. And when you're thinking about Stalingrad, one of the things you need to think about is the crossings at the Volga River. Just these amazing scenes for months where Soviet soldiers are being ferried across the river into this hellscape on the western bank of the Volga River. I read somewhere that the average lifespan of a Soviet soldier at Stalingrad was, I think, it was less than 5 minutes. I mean, it might have been even far less than that. So you have the Soviet army constantly feeding men from the eastern bank of the Volga into the western bank where the basic fighting, the major fighting was happening. You still have civilians in Stalingrad as well. And it's just a a horror scope. It's just a total nightmare. The fighting is very, very close quarters. At times, you would have Soviet soldiers on one floor of a building. You'd have German soldiers on the second floor of the building. Um, just the savagery of the urban warfare was just quite extraordinary and incredibly mind-boggling. And I think what I'm going to do is show some of the scenes from that Stalingrad movie next week in class. So very, very, very bitter fighting from late August 1942 into September, October, November. The Soviets in Stalingrad are just hanging on by their fingernails, just hanging on to the Western Bank by their fingernails. They move into some factories, they create headquarters in factories. The documentary talks about that. But they do manage to hang on, but it's a very, very, very close call. And I think the documentary will be dramatic and show you the how that worked.